about the existence of God. That's not the right approach. Dawkins may be right, but the point is that is not how you do science education. You're going to educate people, that's not how you are going to educate the public. In fact, that is a contradiction in terms. That is, if you're a scientist, that is the most unscientific approach, to approach 5-6 billion people on this planet and tell them they need to grow up. They need to go and read some books. They are ignorant. Is that how you teach science? Would you like me to teach you science like that? And use public funding or grants for that? To run a business? But we have to realize that because of so many opinions, and because of the fact that even if you go within one individual organized religion, now there are 100 different cults and sects. They have their own opinions. Presbyterian Church may not agree with the Episcopalians. All right? The Hasidic Jews may not agree with the modern Jews. So everybody is going to have a different perspective on this. And then let's boil down to an individual sect. If there are 10 million members, there are probably 10 million views. Everybody is an authority on consciousness. How many of you feel you are authority on consciousness? You know what consciousness is. You know what mind is. You all walk around thinking we understand that. So what's the solution then? What do we do? How do we deal with this problem? As nasty as scientific view is probably the best approach. We can criticize science later on, but at least it's consistent. Whether a scientist is doing research on the North Pole or the South Pole, they come up with the same conclusion. They use the same method, which is fair and square, which is unbiased, which is randomized, which is double-blinded if it's medicine. They collect the data. They do not make presuppositions. They do not make assumptions. Are there some scientists who do tricks like that? They are biased. They want to bring their own previously conceived ideas into science. Some of them try that. But they don't live too long, I can tell you. They are thrown out of the system very quickly because their bias quickly get caught. So it's only a free inquiry and an objective view. So you approach a problem without prejudging it, without having preconceptions about what I think mind may be. You drop that idea. You approach it as though you are clueless, you have no idea. You're going to set up an experiment or do a clinical trial or figure out, collect the data, then look at the data and see what it tells you. You're going to observe, experiment, collect the data, analyze, and draw conclusions. And then you're not going to believe just that. You are going to look at someone else's research somewhere else in the world and see, does he have the same conclusions? Science seems to be coming up with the same conclusions, no matter who does it, where it is done, under what circumstances, regardless of if you are Chinese or Hindu or Christian. Therefore, it's going to be worthwhile for us to take that approach. If we don't like it, we can talk about that later. But we must take that approach. Because if you don't, ladies and gentlemen, I have a news for you. It is slippery slope. You know, when you slip and then it's like a slope, you just can't stop now. You make up one thing and then you have to explain that, you have to make up another one. And then you have to make up another one, you have to tell another lie. Before you know, the whole thing is a bunch of hogwash. It's a lot of talk, a lot of beautiful language, but there's nothing in it. For we cannot take one of those approaches. One of the very prominent scientists living in the world today, he tried that. His name is Roger Penrose. He is a very reputable physicist and mathematician at Oxford University, actively researching, writing, and publishing even as we speak today. So he was trying to do some experiments with microtubules inside the neuron. Neuron is a cell in the brain. And he is looking for consciousness in the microtubule because he thinks that's the smallest structure you can find. So it must be as close to quantum mechanics as possible. So he's looking for consciousness in that because he says that there is a wave function collapse. So there must be the answer. The consciousness is in the microtubules. How inappropriate that is for a scientist who has made a name and has earned a lot of respect previously. Here is why I will tell you. When you start breaking rules of scientific method, it becomes a slippery slope. It has now, what he did has given rise to a whole bunch of individuals out there who are writing books and explaining consciousness in microtubules, and there's the Hameroff and the Hagelin, Dr. Hagelin, and then there are a bunch of con men like Deepak Chopra who become billionaires. The fact of the matter is, it's not, consciousness is not to be looked at in quantum mechanics. I'll tell you in a second why that doesn't make sense. So that has become quantum quackery. You have to look for things in the appropriate place. So let me give you an example. When Watson and Crick were looking for the secret of life, what is it that makes us who we are? Is there some kind of code, secret code inside our bodies? They did follow the method of reductionism. That's the orthodoxy of modern science. That's how you're going to find the truth, by reductionism. You start cutting material into pieces, cut into half and half and half and half and half, and until you go to atoms and subatomic particles and keep on going until they could subdivide no more, and we went to quarks. And over there it seems like everything starts to disappear. It changes into something very abstract. But when they were looking for the code of life, they got lucky, I can say. They stopped at the DNA molecule and figured out it's the DNA molecule which codes everything: the color of your eyes, your body, your mind, your tendencies, your proclivities, your behaviors, your physicality. Everything is coded by DNA. Now imagine if we started chopping up the DNA to atoms. Will that explain how life works? So there is appropriate level, I believe, for any explanation of any phenomenon in nature. And we all know this is very simple, straightforward knowledge. If you look at a television, you know that there is actually no picture. It's an illusion, because what happens is these are little pixels. Some of them are brighter than others. So depending on how much light comes from each pixel, it's going to put together and give you the illusion that there's a picture on the screen. How many of have you been to a big stadium where they have a huge screen bigger than this wall? You can almost see the squares, pixels, right? So we know that this illusion of the picture on the TV screen is explained by the phenomenon of how bright and light and dark spots put together give you that illusion. Now imagine someone wants to look for explanation for that illusion at the level of the electrons. Will that get you anywhere? It won't, because it won't make any sense to start looking for answers at the level of quantum physics or quantum chemistry. It will not give you any answers. So I believe if you want to look for in the brain, go ahead, be my guest, but last 15 to 20 years of research is clearly has given us enough body of evidence that this is going to be explained, if it is going to be explained ever, is going to be at the level of neuronal connections. What Christoph and Crick call neuronal correlates of consciousness. They've been doing research. By the way, Crick is the same guy who was the co-discoverer of DNA in 1957. He's working on this issue for the last 15 to 20 years. So everything has to be reset at the appropriate level. Now, how do you know what is appropriate level? I think Penn Roosevelt asked me, you know, who the hell are you to decide what's appropriate level? How do you know what is appropriate level? Yes, I do not know what's appropriate level, but here's my argument. If you've been, hundreds of people all over the world have been doing research for, scores of years and consistently finding out that it's the connectivity in the brain that is correlated with our awareness and consciousness, so that is the basis to know that that is the appropriate level to look for consciousness if you are going to look for consciousness in the brain. So I was talking about slippery slope. Once you start something, and he really meant well. Penrose is a very respectable physicist. He really meant well. He was wondering, this is a very complex problem. I'm not oversimplifying it. He was wondering if the brain will ever explain consciousness. Maybe there is something else, because mathematics is not all computational, he argues. But what that has done is to given rise to hundreds of writers, including people who don't have a clue about science, writing books, making a lot of money, and swindling the public. So in order to avoid that kind of slippery slope, we do not really have a choice but to stick to what science has to say. Later on we will deal with if we don't like what science has to say. Now when science starts looking at the problem of consciousness, we run into a brick wall right away. And I'll tell you what that brick wall is. It turns out, before we even start explaining the phenomenon, it turns out that we think we are conscious of our environment and we are conscious and aware of everything. And we also think that we understand what consciousness is or how to define consciousness. Actually, there is no definition. And secondly, if we take the general understanding that all of us have about what consciousness is or may be, we run into problems already. I'm going to give you two kinds of examples. How poorly conscious we are of our environment, how miserable we are. We can look at two kinds of examples. One is things that are not obvious. We assume that we know it all, but we are clueless. What goes on any significant distance away from our eyes or ears, we are clueless. Right there, we are not conscious of anything. And then the second, you might say, well, how can you expect me to be conscious of something about the stars or about the universe? Talk about me interacting with the environment. Are you confident that you are very aware of your environment? I'll give you an example to show you you are very poorly aware of your environment. You know pretty much nothing. After we discuss that problem, then we will see what science has done, because we still have to answer the question. We can't get away with it. We can't just say consciousness is false, it's not real thing, and go home. We still have a challenge to face. So let me give you some examples. First, I will give you some examples of things that we generally don't think about or we are not aware. We were born one day, 80 years later we die, and we never thought about it. Okay? Here's an example. Let me ask you, how many of do you realize, I'm going to give you an example, that this theater where you are sitting, when you came in here an hour ago and 2 hours later the seminar is over, you are 2,000 miles away from where